Okay, all right. And just to tell you a little bit more about myself, I got a master's degree in psychology, a master's degree in Christian leadership, and PhD in clinical psychology from Fuller Theological Seminary. Then I went on to do some advanced clinical training, which sounds fancier than it really is, but that's what makes me a neuropsychologist, is I have additional training in how the brain works and the impact of brain damage or brain injuries on behavior and emotional functioning and that sort of thing. And I have to say, too, a lot of you probably know my wife and know my family, and if you've met my kids, you know that I have no clue what I'm talking about, really. I'm just totally making this stuff up, so bear with me. A lot of this stuff was kind of rusty, too, from, hadn't actually kind of thought about a lot of these things since graduate school, so I had to kind of dust off the books a little bit. And yeah, Rachel told, as I was leaving today, this morning, Rachel told me, don't embarrass me. And then she said, you'll do great. So anyway, yeah. So, let's see if I can figure this out here. Okay, so what is anxiety? And I think people have covered this before, so sorry if I'm kind of being redundant and repeating what other people have talked about. But I did want to at least kind of define it a little bit just for the purposes of our discussion. So clinical anxiety, this is taken from the DSM, the diagnostic manual that we use in mental health. And it's defined as apprehension, tension, or uneasiness that stems from the anticipation of danger, which may be internal or external, real or imagined. It goes beyond that, though, right? It's feelings of dread, stress, agitation. There's 3 different kinds of domains that anxiety affects. There are affective symptoms, which is just kind of the subjective feeling of anxiety. There's the cognitive domain, which is basically intrusive thoughts, not being able to stop thinking about it, kind of negative-based thoughts. And then it also affects us physically. As I was sitting here waiting to come up, my heart started beating a little bit faster and started to get a little bit nervous, but it can take its toll on us physically as well. It's also important to realize that to some extent, anxiety is actually beneficial in small amounts. Like, it helps keep us safe. It helps us identify danger. It helps us be aware that, okay, maybe I'm in a situation that could potentially be harmful or difficult. And there's also stress that's a normal reaction to a difficult life situation. So it's actually, we get a little bit worried about people who don't have any sort of stress in a difficult situation. If they don't, have some anguish or some distress about something that their family's going through, or something that's happened to them at their work, or some sort of accident that somebody's had. It's actually a little bit unusual to not have some anxiety. So some of that's good, but we get more concerned when it becomes a more pervasive pattern, to the point where it's happening most of the time, and it's causing significant feelings of discomfort. It's starting to interfere with activities. It's starting to get in the way of what people are willing to do. And we can often see where people start kind of narrowing their world more and more and withdrawing from things in order to avoid triggering that anxiety. I'm not going to go into all the specifics, but through lots of work and research, people have identified different symptom clusters that are used when making diagnoses, anxiety diagnoses. The one that I'm going to talk about mostly is probably generalized anxiety, which is basically when somebody has a lot of worries, a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety that keeps happening most of the time, most days. Now, sometimes this is actually worrying about things, but sometimes it's more somebody who is tightly wound, somebody who's easily overwhelmed, somebody who has difficulty adjusting when something unexpected happens, and they kind of get overwhelmed and stuck. But there are other kinds of anxiety too. There's social anxiety, which is basically extreme shyness. Everybody knows the person who probably doesn't really say much, and if you approach them or talk to them, they might kind of look down, or they might kind of mumble. Those can be signs of social anxiety. Nowadays, we see a lot of people who use their phone in order to avoid interacting with people because that causes them some anxiety. Phobias, actually, ironically enough, public speaking is one of the most common phobias out there. But phobias can be fears of snakes and spiders and that sort of thing, but also fears of specific situations like test anxiety, that sort of thing. OCD, I'm not going to really get into that a lot, but it's a lot of intrusive fears and thoughts and concerns about things having to be just right, and then behaviors that go along with that to try to make things just right and make that discomfort go away. Panic disorder, panic attacks are basically like a rapid onset of like the fight or flight kind of reaction where people feel like they have to flee, they have to escape, they have to get out of there or else they're going to die or something catastrophic is going to happen. And then PTSD, I think most people have heard of that, especially with a lot of the combat trauma that we've had that's been in the news lately. So I'm going to kind of skip through that. One thing I wanted to point out too, and this actually isn't a part of the diagnostic manual, but it really should be. I see this a lot in kids, but there's a lot of people who, they don't have anxiety like in the traditional sense, like I'm worried about something. It more comes out as anger. And we can see a pattern where sometimes people can be more set in their expectations, more rigid in their expectations, and if things don't turn out the way they expect, that rather than the flight response, they get the fight response that comes out. I think this in particular happens in men, so just something to be aware of, that it's not always worrying about things. Sometimes it's general kind of agitation or anger that's coming up that really is actually kind of a manifestation of anxiety. Now, I think when I first started doing this, I used to think that kids, when they were born, they kind of came out carte blanche, and you could kind of mold them into whatever you wanted them to be, and if they didn't turn out, perfect, that it was the parents' fault. Now I know that that's not even close. Really, the more I've been doing this, the more I'm convinced that people come out hardwired a certain way. They're just born with different temperaments. They're born with different tendencies based on how their brain is wired. And there is good evidence out there that indicates that some people are just born towards being more anxiety prone than other people are. Like their brain is just more wired to respond that way. And there's a few different ways of looking at this, but one of the most, I think, well-known or prevalent ways of looking at this is looking at temperament, which is basically kind of general demeanor. And we see that some kids are born and they are high maintenance. They're fussy, they're hard to soothe, and they're more reactive if there's a change in environment or a change in stimuli, like a change in what's going on around them. They're more activated or agitated during noisy situations than other children are, and it can take more work to get them calm, and they're quick to react again if something kind of different happens. Those same kids then, as they grow older, they develop what's called behavioral inhibition, which basically these are kids who, in new situations, they clam up, they shut down. These are kids that can be very clingy. They won't let go of your pants, even though you're in a situation, maybe it's a little bit new, but they're still familiar with it, and they become withdrawn. And these kids then are ones who are more likely to go on and develop anxiety disorders when they get older, such as social anxiety, generalized anxiety. And the problem is that, in a certain sense, is a little bit of a vicious cycle. Because these kids are more dissipated and withdrawn, we see then that they have more negative interactions or not as good positive interactions with other people, and so it's kind of reinforced. Things don't go well for me socially because I'm shy, because I'm reserved, I'm withdrawn, and then because of that, I associate negative interactions with being around people, so I'm going to withdraw even more. And these are people that can go on to have increased risk for problems with drug and alcohol abuse, like I mentioned, anxiety disorders, and other things too, like depression and that sort of thing. I think that also goes to highlight the fact that when we're talking about these things, we talk about them in very kind of defined, discrete ways. But in real life, there's a lot of overlap between these things. And there's also a lot of other things that can go on too. When I previously mentioned the anxiety disorders and diagnoses that can happen, I didn't mention, or I forgot to mention, that along with those things, we also see where people have oftentimes attention problems, depression, low self-esteem, other things too that kind of complicate the picture. And so even though we kind of talk about it in a neat and tidy way, real life is more messy. And we can see where these things can kind of, it's a vicious cycle, and these things can kind of perpetuate. Now, can you guys see this? Is that picture big enough? So there are some different parts of the brain that are involved with anxiety. And one of the primary areas is called the amygdala. And it's kind of in the very deep down in the middle of your brain. I believe it's Latin for almond, and only because it looked like an almond, not due to some fancier reason. That part is one of the main parts that helps you identify threats, either threats that are happening around you or imagined threats that you think could happen. And that's the part that basically identifies potential threats. It's the part that basically starts to give the emotional reaction to that. It starts the fight or flight kind of reaction. That part triggers another part called the hypothalamus, which is kind of right above it, and that's one of the main areas that prepares your body for this reaction as well. Like, releases, or it's involved with the release of adrenaline, cortisol, other kinds of stress hormones that basically ramp up your sympathetic nervous system and gets you ready to either fight or flee. There's other parts involved too. There's another part called the hippocampus, which is also kind of right next to the amygdala. The hippocampus is the main part of your brain that is responsible for converting short-term memory into long-term memories. And as a part of that too, it helps associate emotional connections with those memories. And so I don't know if anybody's had like deja vu before, a sense of this is familiar. Well, that's actually that's where the hippocampus and the amygdala actually kind of misfire. And there's an emotional response to a situation that actually, you have that same response in other situations, that's true, but sometimes it misfires. But that part helps you think back and remember, oh, okay, well, when this happened before, something bad turned out, or I thought something bad was going to turn out. And so that helps inform the amygdala that, yes, this is a genuine threat or not. There's another part, too, called the orbital frontal cortex, which is, if you look on the very left of the picture and kind of drop down into kind of, I guess kind of the bottom left part, it's right above your eyeballs. And this part is responsible for anticipating rewards and punishments. Now, this is important because, like I mentioned before, this is part of the process that's important in terms of whether people have kind of an angry reaction or not, based on the difference between what they thought was going to happen or what they thought they were going to get and how things then actually didn't turn out. And the discrepancy between those things is what often can trigger anxiety or can trigger anger. This part also helps extinguish fear reactions. And so this part helps kind of suppress the amygdala. It helps put the brakes on the amygdala and kind of helps self-regulate that. But if this part's not working as well as it should, then there can be a weaker ability for that part to put the brakes on the fear or the stress or the angry reaction. There's another part that plays an even bigger role in that. It's called the prefrontal cortex, or the dorsal medial frontal cortex. And where it says on the picture frontal lobe, that's kind of the main region of that. Now, this part is responsible for being able to hypothesize what might happen. It's also responsible for being able to detect changes in the situation, and it's the part that helps you be flexible in your thinking. So when things don't turn out the way you expect, it helps you shift your thinking in response to that in an adaptive sort of way. This part is also the part that plays probably an even bigger role in calming down the amygdala. And it says, hey, actually, it's not as bad as you thought it was, or you need to take this into account. Maybe we need to not get as agitated or worried or stressed, because what you thought was a threat actually isn't that big a deal. And this also is, unfortunately, though, the same part that can imagine or hypothesize potential threats in the future. And sometimes for some people, that plays a bigger role than this part of the brain's ability to actually suppress the amygdala. And so this is where people can get very caught up in thinking about, well, this might happen, like the what ifs. Something bad might happen, or this is going to be the worst ever, I'm not going to be able to handle this, and kind of imagining kind of worst case scenarios. So it can be a bit of a double-edged sword. In the one hand, that part helps you stop the fear reaction, but on the other hand, that part can also kind of fan the flames of the amygdala, the main anxiety and fear part. The language centers of the brain also seem to play a role. They're not in this picture. They're really kind of located on this side of your brain. This is a cross-section in the picture as if it was going right down the middle, so we're looking at the insides. But on the left side of your brain, that's the language center. In particular, people who have generalized anxiety, where they kind of worry about the latest worry of the day, or they stress easily. These parts seem to be overactive, and there's a lot of internal self-talk. There's a lot of perpetuation and rumination of potentially bad outcomes. Like, this is the inner voice that's telling you things are bad, things aren't going to work out well, I'm not going to do well in this. And some people, there's a greater chance that they can get stuck in kind of like a circular loop in saying those things to themselves, and they get caught up in that internal dialogue. Now, the thing I want to point out to people is that everybody's brain parts that we're talking about work different, and everybody's born with different abilities in these areas. People often ask, well, is it nature or nurture that causes anxiety? And I think, the common refrain is it's both, depending on how much your parents messed you up. But we all are also born with different neurological abilities. Like, these parts work better for some people than for others. And so to some extent, too, this is also kind of a part of our personality, and some people may struggle with these parts not working maybe as efficiently as they could, or not getting fired up in the right balance. I talk about these parts individually, but really they work as a whole system. And if any part gets thrown off, it kind of throws off the whole thing. And so, I think it's important to keep in mind, not just when we're thinking about ourselves, but also when we're having compassion for other people. I often hear people maybe who don't have problems in these areas, they're quick to pass judgment on other people about, well, you just need to move on, or you just need to deal with it, or you just need to grow a stiff upper lip. But for some people, these parts of the brain are the parts that would help you do that. And if they're not working as well as they should, that can be a big order. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. All right. So when it comes to cognitive theories, there have been a lot of research studies, like mountains and mountains of research studies, that have looked at how people who have anxiety process information, how their brain works, and maybe how that compares to people who don't have anxiety and how their brain processes information. And they've found some differences. So in general, there do tend to be a greater chance of cognitive biases or patterns in which people process information in an inaccurate way. So for example, people who are anxiety prone, they have a bigger autonomic reaction to threatening or aversive stimuli than people who don't have anxiety. Like, their body ramps up quicker, and their brain activates that fight or flight reaction faster and to a greater degree than people who are not anxiety prone. We also see where when people have anxiety, if there is some sort of negative stimulus or potential threat, it's hard for them to not focus on that. There's what we call attention capture. And one of the things that we measure in neuropsychology is attention, and how do you allocate attention? Can you multitask? Can you shift your attention effectively in order to do what you have to do in that situation? And when people have anxiety, they have a hard time shifting away from that anxiety-provoking stimulus, greater than other people who don't have anxiety. So it really can be very consuming. It can suck them in. We also see where when that happens, it actually, to a greater extent, interferes with their ability to problem solve, to generate solutions, to think of ideas, and to basically step back and obtain perspective on what's happening. It actually cognitively interferes with the problem-solving process to a greater extent than we see in people who don't have anxiety. So it's hard to get out of that, and it's hard to think of solutions, because if you have anxiety, you're very much sucked into it, and it really interferes with brain functioning in other parts that would help you adapt. We can also see where there's a greater chance that stimuli that's really kind of neutral or ambiguous, it's rated as more threatening by people who have anxiety compared to people who don't. And we also see where there's a memory bias in people who have anxiety, where they're more likely to remember negative events than they are positive events. And there's kind of like a bit of a self-confirming philosophy or self-fulfilling prophecy, in the sense that they kind of ignore the times where things didn't work out in a negative way, and they focus on the few times that it did, and then act in a way that actually causes that to happen again. And it can be very kind of validating of their perception. And we also see where there is, just even when there's no threat present, we can see where when people are anxiety prone, they do score lower on tests of cognitive flexibility. They're more kind of a tendency to kind of be one-track mind, to be more of what we call a sequential processor rather than a simultaneous processor. And we can see where they have deficits in or weaknesses in ideation, which is what I talked about before, like generating solutions, generating ideas, even when there isn't a high level of anxiety that's happening. And we also see, too, where they can have a harder time tolerating ambiguity or uncertainty. There's more of a need to know. And if they're in a situation that it isn't clear or things are uncertain, that can, in and of itself, increase anxiety, even in a situation where it's not a threatening situation or there isn't something that's triggering their anxiety. So, not everybody's like this, and these things are all on a continuum. I don't want to paint it like it's a black and white dichotomy and all or nothing sort of thing. But in general, as a group, when people are anxiety prone, we see that they have more weaknesses with these things than people who are not anxiety prone. So there's probably lots of different clinical theories about why people have anxiety. I'm just going to kind of focus on two of them. One of them, Freud. Everybody's probably heard of Dr. Freud. He basically thought everything was about your inner urges coming out. Originally, his theory was that anxiety was repressed sexual urges. Then he changed that over time and attributed it to some sort of childhood trauma, which he called castration anxiety. I still am not sure why he came up with that term. You have to remember, Freud liked cocaine, and I couldn't find it for today, but somewhere I have a picture of a prescription written by Dr. Freud for Dr. Freud for cocaine. But anyway, that even people who are still psychodynamic, which is kind of like the modern version of Freudian theory, they don't really attribute it to that. But they do put a heavy emphasis on childhood experiences during certain developmental phases as then having a significant impact on you as you grow older and things that you carry forward. Unfortunately, those things it's hard to define those things, and oftentimes it's hard to identify any kind of specific event or situation that's happened. And so in the 1950s, there was kind of a new theory that came out, or a new model of anxiety that came out by Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck. And basically they thought, okay, what's really happening when people have anxiety is they have these firmly held irrational beliefs, exaggerated beliefs, things that are blown out of proportion, but they're applying those underlying beliefs to basically every situation. And then as a result of that, they're interpreting that situation in a way that confirms that strongly held belief that they have that's actually irrational. So for example, some of the ones that they listed, or that they described people often having, I must win the approval of others, or else I'm no good. Everyone should treat me kindly. Life must be fair. I'm unlovable or inadequate. I cannot tolerate discomfort, uncertainty, or ambiguity. Mistakes mean I'm a failure. And this is my favorite one. The government is trying to control me. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you, I guess. But they said the problem is not that these events cause you to feel a certain way, but you have these strongly held beliefs and you interpret events based on those beliefs, which then causes you to feel a certain way. And they also said that you have assumptions that you use when you are interpreting events. The assumptions tend to be kind of all or nothing. They tend to be, like I said before, validating of those strongly held beliefs, such as if someone doesn't call me back today, that means they don't like me, or something like that. There's probably many kind of different versions out there, but something like that, where there's an assumption of an event that validates that firmly held underlying belief, and then that causes me to feel a certain way. And they postulated that these things actually cause chronic patterns of anxiety and depression in people because they were maladaptive, they were non-functional, and they were actually inaccurate. And then as a result of that, what would happen... Oops, I forgot I was going to show you that. As a result of that, then people resort to ineffective coping strategies. They end up kind of perpetuating these beliefs that they have about the world. And then actually, too, in order to avoid anxiety, they actually end up avoiding situations that would otherwise trigger that anxiety. So if I feel stressed about coming to church and having to talk to people, then I just avoid going to church and I feel better. So there's kind of a reinforcing process there. There's a sense of relief. There's also a tendency to adopt simplistic, Rachel said this was too fancy sounding. I didn't do this to sound smart. But simplistic heuristics. These are overly simplistic decision-making processes. Basically, when I make a decision about something, I'm going to ignore information that might contradict my belief because that makes me too uncomfortable. And so I'm just going to either ignore it or I'm going to devalue it or basically explain it away and rationalize it. And I'm going to make decisions then that make me feel comfortable but aren't actually necessarily good decisions. But then that also perpetuates anxiety or, things not working out for me, and it kind of validates that underlying held belief, if that makes sense. So that's really kind of the quick summary. Sorry, I guess I went through that a little bit faster than I realized. How long was that?
25 minutes.
It's 25 minutes? Oh, okay. It's better than I thought. It always feels shorter when I'm standing up here. I think, and somebody once said to me when I was in seminary, somebody said to me, if you think about it, Christianity, our faith, is also an irrational belief, which is true in a certain sense. But I think my response to that is, it is, but that's where faith comes in. And that's where faith makes that actually a very meaningful belief for us. But what else are we putting our belief in? What else are we putting our faith in that's maybe not at the same level, that's maybe not, related to Christ, but beliefs that still have a heavy influence on our thinking and on our problem solving, which then actually contribute to the anxiety that we can potentially feel. So I'd just throw that out there as something maybe to kind of consider, something to talk about. And I just came up with these discussion questions. I'm not very good at leading discussions and stuff like that. So I don't know. There's probably better discussion topics that people can think of in your small groups, but I just wanted to throw this out there as things to think about. But what do we say to ourselves that actually make us feel worse? What are our kind of underlying, firmly held beliefs that we may try to force situations into, that we may interpret in when we're at our work, when we're with our family, in other situations? And how can our relationship with God correct maybe those underlying beliefs that are irrational or inaccurate? How can they replace them or inform them? Or how can it replace them or inform them? And also, too, in what areas of my life can I be more flexible? Because this is the one that I run across. I mostly do clinical work, and I see a lot of kids. And this is, I think, for a lot of kids and adults, I would assume, this is something that causes a lot of distress, is difficulty being flexible. I think the more rigid we are in our thinking, what happens is we run across more situations that don't turn out the way we expect. If we have a hard time adapting and looking at it differently, that contributes to a lot of distress. And most of the time when I see kids who have meltdowns, like angry, uncontrollable outbursts, where they're like a 12 on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of how tightly wound they are, this is one of the major underlying weaknesses that they have. And I'm sure it doesn't just go away as we become adults. So, just something to think about. Any questions, I guess? Or no, do we do Q&A or I don't know. Okay. Any questions or comments? Yeah.
You said faith was irrational. But the Word of God, of course, gives us the rational ground.
Right, exactly. Well, I guess what I'm saying is, from an outside perspective, from a worldly perspective, it doesn't make sense. But it does to us, and part of how that makes sense to us is we put our faith in that, right? But, there's no room for other things that we're putting our faith in that are irrational. Like, that's the thing that should dominate our life. That's the thing that should inform our decision-making, right? Sometimes, though, it's hard because it's not always clear, right? I think sometimes the Bible gives us a lot of answers, but it doesn't always it's not always as specific as we would like. But what other things are we putting up on that same pedestal, right? That aren't warranted, that shouldn't be up there.
Like Freud.
What's that?
Like Freud.
Like Freud, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Let's had a question.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, back here? Sorry, what's that? Oh, you mean like medication for this sort of thing? Is somebody else going to talk about interventions, or?
Not necessarily specifically,
Okay.
so go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's two main classes of medications that are used to treat anxiety. One is like antidepressant medication, like serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors. And remember, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I don't prescribe medicine, so I can only kind of speak secondhand to what I see and what I know just through research and stuff. But, you know, those are probably kind of the initial frontline choice for treatment of anxiety. They're modestly effective. You know, I think that in a situation where we know that, well, we don't want to be too quick to jump on medicine, right? We don't want to be kind of use it as an easy out. We don't want to use it as kind of a quick fix. At the same time, though, kind of like I mentioned earlier, we also have to realize that some people, like, this is at least in part neurological. Like, this is how their brain is wired. And so sometimes addressing the biology of it helps them at least kind of function at a level where then they can also apply other ways of managing it. It can kind of create a foundation where they're able to do that. Just if you look at the research study, though, I mean, they're modestly effective. They don't do a 180 on this. There are other medications like benzodiazepines that are highly effective, but those ones are habit forming, so you can really only supposed to take them kind of for short term or in kind of acute moments.
Talking of medications, I had a situation where I couldn't eat out at the table.
Mm-hmm.
I could eat out at a buffet because I wasn't fenced in. And I remember my daughter, or my grandfather's daughter, saying, "That's rubbish." But it was rubbish to him, and it probably was rubbish to me. But I didn't. But I found that a couple of beers would solve that problem.
Yeah. Yep. And yes, and you know, about 30 to 40% of your neurons are inhibitory in your brain, right? About 30 to 40% of them, their job is to calm things down and suppress things. And the vast majority of those neurons are GABA, which is a specific neurotransmitter. Alcohol, actually, there's three receptors on GABA. One is basically the alcohol receptor, one is barbiturate receptor, and the other, I can't remember what the third one is. But anyway, alcohol, yeah, I mean, it does actually activate those inhibitory mechanisms. Unfortunately, that also causes people trouble too sometimes, right? So that's why people who have anxiety are at increased risk for drug and alcohol problems, because they start self-medicating, and then it becomes an issue.
Hey, James, memory bias. A lot of us can identify with remembering a negative situation in the past a lot more than a positive one. How do you rewire or think about, how do you change that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And basically learning active strategies to basically counteract that. And that's, you know, in part when people go to cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a specific kind of counseling, that kind of counseling is focused on specific techniques that you can use to help promote that. And so basically kind of learning other ways in an active sort of way to try to stay ahead of that, and kind of be actively engaged in that rather than kind of reverting to the default, you know, kind of like that automatic. There are definitely things that you can do about it. And there's a lot of different treatment options. You know, it does take work though, especially kind of the more hardwired someone is to having these tendencies. You know, the more work it takes to kind of set new patterns and learn new things and ways of thinking and kind of evoking change, I guess.
Carl?
How do eating disorders figure into all this?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, and so the question was, how do eating disorders contribute to this or play a role in this? And that's a good question. Eating disorders seem to be a little bit more complex because there is anxiety that can be involved. You know, people tend to have anxiety and depression when they have eating disorders. Some eating disorders are obsessive in nature, right? They have kind of like those intrusive thoughts that I have to be thin, I have to be thin, I have to be thin. And it's hard to stop those thoughts from popping into the head. Some eating disorders tend to be impulsive and very disinhibited. And I don't know enough about it to really kind of explain in a more detailed sort of way, but I think, kind of like I mentioned before, anxiety is interwoven with a lot of other things, with attention disorders, eating disorders, even kind of things like depression. It's hard to differentiate between depression and anxiety oftentimes because they kind of look the same and they happen together. So I think, I don't know if I can be more specific, sorry, but it's certainly a part of it.
Let's do one more, Dick.
Well, if we come out hardwired, how tough is it to change? Is everybody hardwired, and then it's really tough to change that?
It depends on how hardwired you are, I guess. It's on a continuum, right? And so the way I've kind of looked at it is, I don't have a way to draw a picture, but with any sort of cognitive process, it's on a continuum. Some people are really good at it, and some people are really poor at it. Your biology, like your hardwiring, probably sets a range on that continuum under which you can fall. Your nurture, your life experience, your parents, that sort of thing, they probably then determine within those parameters where you're likely to fall. Right, so there are some limitations. Like I can't necessarily, if somebody is having panic attacks and they're always on edge and their anxiety is like a 12 out of 10, it's probably unrealistic to think that they could get to a 1, right, and be like that all the time. But again, could probably get them to like a 3, 2 or 3, maybe 4, which is huge improvement. That's a big quality of life improvement. But we have to be, I think, it's going to be dependent on what we're starting with, and people are going to be different as far as kind of their base.
Awesome, thank you. That's fantastic. That was perfect. I mean, what a practical and helpful overview of how the brain works and everything else. That couldn't have been more succinct and helpful. Let me close this in prayer, and then we'll move to our groups. Father, thank you for reminding us that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and all of our brains are different, they function differently, our temperaments are different, and yet you have called us to live together in community, to encourage one another, to help one another, to inform one another, to pray for one another, and you tell us in your word to be transformed daily by the renewing of our minds, Lord. So keep us soaked in your word, keep us soaked in our love for you and for one another, Lord, as we continue to learn these incredible things about our minds, hearts, and bodies. And bless us in our groups this morning, we pray in Christ's name. Amen.